Hi and welcome to the board. Happy New Year to everybody. This is our 44th episode. I'm Kirsten Donaldson and I'm joined by Jesse Stegman.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Today we're going to be talking about estimating. We thought we'd devote a whole show to estimating because we did a workshop recently where we had some quite long conversations around it and some interesting points came up, so we thought we'd have a go at talking about that for 20 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the first things we thought we'd talk about is how stories are traditionally estimated using Agile. Now, one of the things that people have a little trouble grasping is the fact that the size of stories are determined against other stories. So rather than saying this story is large or small, we compare it to another story. And there's a particularly good exercise we use in workshops, which I'm going to ask Jess to explain because that's what I normally do, around using a graphical example. So Rebecca, if you could put that picture up on the screen for us to use.
Yeah, so what we talk about here is we've got a picture of the skyline of Hong Kong. And if you look at the really tall building on the right, if I asked you to estimate, Kirsten, if you could tell me how tall that building is in meters.
Well, looking at it, it's probably like, say, 200 floors or something like that. And each floor is going to be, say, 2 meters, 3 meters high. I don't really know, I'm not very good at dimensions, but let's say 3 meters.
Yeah.
So 200 stories times 3 meters, 600, is that right? I'm not really good at see that. Actually, well, I think the point I'm trying to get to is that I'm going to find it very hard to estimate that, and I'm not very spatially aware, but let's say 500 meters.
All right. Cool. I have no idea. Just putting it out there, unfortunately. But what we can see there is it's taken Kirsten a really long time to estimate, and she's probably not got that close to an accurate estimate. If I then said to Kirsten, so the building to further right with the purple roof, if we say that is 300 meters, how big is the tall building we were talking about before?
Well, if I compare one to another just visually quickly, I can see that the tall building is probably twice the size of the blue and purple building. So if the blue and purple building is 300 meters or a 3, I'd call that building a 6 or 600 meters.
All right, so that's a really quick example of how we can accurately estimate things using relative sizing. So we understand sort of that one piece of work, the smaller building is a 3, and we think that the really tall building, the really large piece of work is double the effort. So using relative sizing, we'd then say it's a 6. We don't have a 6 in our scale, so we might bump it up to an 8 or down to a 5.
So one of the questions that came up during the workshop we were doing the other day on this was, but how do you know how much the original story is to size it against if you're first starting out in a sprint? So we had a couple of answers to this. One of them was that it's quite hard if you're a new team and you're starting out on your first sprint. But one of the exercises that can be done is using Swimlanes. So we generally on a table set out some blue taped lanes and put the size cards up the top. So our sizes we use are 1, 3, 5, 8, 13.
2 in the middle, 1, 2, 3, 5.
1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, maybe 13, don't always use it. So we pop those in, and then we look through the stories with the team, and the team decides which story might be sort of about a medium size. Just for as an example, to put in the middle of those swim lanes on, say, the 5 or the 3, depending on where you think the middle is. Pop that in there and then size every other story against that middle size story. Now this isn't something where you just go ahead and do all that. You'll then stand back and review all those stories in the swim lanes. Have a look at the one you've got in the middle. Is that accurate? Does that need to move? And negotiate with your team members until you've got a batch of size stories. So this can really help to get started on your first sprint. Other techniques we use during the course of a project are planning poker, which I'm sure we've talked about before, where the team holds those sizing cards in their hands, reads out the story, and then finds a consensus on what that size is. that can be very difficult for a start. So that Swimlanes
Yeah.
is a great way of sizing up a bunch of stories.
Really quickly.
Just to get started.
Yeah.
And you can always go back and resize them if they're drastically different after you've worked on them.
Yeah.
And that can give you a better idea for future sprints.
Absolutely. I think just one point to note as well is the story that you choose to be that your sort of middle and first story. Try and make that one that your team is relatively certain about their estimate, because it is your basis for your scale. If you get that first story sort of horribly wrong, in terms of estimate, it can throw things off a bit. But try and pick something that's fairly easy and the team are fairly confident around the idea. I was also introduced to a new technique just yesterday, actually. One of the teams that we're working with, the product owner did what he called a story gallery.
Right.
So what he did was he had a new feature and about 20 stories that he wanted sized. So he got all the stories and put them around a big meeting room. And the team went round individually and read the story themselves. He was in the room, so each member could ask him questions about the story to sort of understand each story better. And then once they had a good understanding, they all sized the story individually. So they just wrote down a number on a post-it note, put it in a little box next to the story. And then at the end, they quickly tallied up all the sizes. Anything that had sort of a unanimous consensus, that was the size for it. And then any stories where there was big discrepancy, like in Planning Poker, they had a bit more of a discussion about it. And he said that worked. In an hour, he got 20 stories estimated, and really well too. So
like a good idea. I think one of the other things that we covered the other day that came up, we were talking about why we plan for anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks for a sprint. And Jess, you had a good analogy for the reason why. Originally we were talking about the cone of uncertainty in software, where when you first start working on a feature, the gap between what you know about it now and what you know about it at the end is very, very wide. And then as you move towards the end of that build, cone goes down until you get to the very end and you know everything about the feature, including how long it took to develop. So at the start it's very hard to do an accurate estimate, and that's one of the reasons we don't spend a whole heap of time trying to nail down that estimate to hours and days and whatever. We just give it a size. But you had that good analogy when you asked someone a question about what they thought they might achieve.
So we were just talking about sort of how, in Scrum we limit our iterations to a month usually. We prefer 2 weeks. But also with estimates, part of the reason we do that is it's very hard to estimate beyond a month. So if I asked someone what they think they're going to achieve in the next 3 months in terms of physical output of work, so how many proposals will you write in the next 6 months, Kirsten?
How many projects will a Scrum Master?
It's very, very difficult to give an accurate estimate, and you're probably going to be up this end of the cone where you've got, you might be way over or way under what you're actually going to achieve. But if I then say to you, okay, well, what are you going to achieve in the next week? How many proposals are you going to get? You probably have quite a good idea. If I go even narrower than that, what are you going to do tomorrow? You can give me a really accurate estimate, and then back down again. What are you going to do this afternoon? Even more detailed. Yeah.
So that's why we plan for shorter periods, because it doesn't make us completely accurate, but we have more chance of having a good view of how things are going to take.
And I think that also leads on to, I suppose, a little thing with planning is not getting too, acknowledging that if you're planning for a long range sort of estimate, that maybe it is better to give a range. So say to a client, we imagine this feature will be delivered in the last quarter, or if you're talking of the year
project.
or of the project. as you get closer, you can update that estimate to okay, we're going to deliver it in this sprint, and then maybe during the sprint you'll have a release date for that feature.
So one of the reasons we were talking about this was because we were delivering a workshop on Agile Planning. So one of the criticisms we hear of Agile is that the lack of certainty in project delivery dates, feature delivery dates. So of course I would counter that with the fact that in traditional projects where you specify everything up front and you're doing your Gantt chart up front for the entire life of the project, what you end up with is a bunch of dates that we would term to be wishful thinking. Because that kind of uncertainty is so wide at that point that there's just no possibility that those dates are going to be correct on a feature or epic by epic basis.
Yeah.
And you know, developers are asked to commit to that wishful thinking, which is very unrealistic. Whereas if we are doing these shorter term estimates, the likelihood is that people are going to be much more comfortable committing to that. Yeah. Particularly if they've been directly involved in making those estimates via sprint planning and story sizing. Yeah. And they're going to be much more comfortable with saying, yeah, in likelihood that's what's going to happen.
Well, and I also think in that case as well is people are inherently positive with their estimates, especially long range forecasting. So, you know, and they don't know if you come to a developer and say, hey, we've got this whole piece of software that we're going to develop. Do you think it'll be done in 18 months' time? You know, that sort of range seems realistic to anyone. Yeah. You know, you're like, yeah, that's a really long time. It's really complex, but sure, we can finish it in that amount of time. And then people get held to that, which is unfortunate.
Right. And of course, you know, if you are committing to something that's supposedly going to happen in 18 months' time, that doesn't account for being flexible and allowing change, and for outside conditions to change as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, perhaps the market might change and the product you're working on is no longer suitable for delivery. Yeah. You know, so if you've committed and saying, yes, this is what it looks like and this is when it's going to be delivered, it's very hard to deviate from that, as I think we've seen on a number of large projects, certainly in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely.
That have, you know, come out the other end and not being entirely suited to their intended purpose.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think the other thing as well is if you're estimating those small chunks, so grooming your backlog regularly and just asking people to estimate small manageable pieces of work, you can then take that entire backlog and get a really good estimate on when you will be delivering things without having to ask people for those long range sort of guesses as well.
Yeah, that's right. But then, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, the important thing is to keep revisiting that.
Yeah.
Don't just expect that to be written in stone for the lifetime of the project, which is what we see on those more traditional project management. You know, it's like once you've got that date, that's it. There's no deviation from it, and people end up having to work longer hours to meet it.
Yeah, and I think I read a really interesting quote recently that try and change the sort of your reports that you develop for your planning and look at them not as a fixed document, but I suppose an update of the status of your project at a certain point in time. So, you know, in January,
so this is what we've done.
Yeah, this is what we've done. This is what, given what we know currently, this is where we think things are going to come out. So maybe you do that in January. 3 months down the track, you produce another one and say, all right, well, this is what's changed. This is now where we see things going. Or, hey, everything's gone really well and we still think we're on track to deliver these things at these points in time.
And that's really part of being transparent about the reality of a situation. You know, the board helps with that on a short-term basis, but you know, if you were doing reporting to state what's happening as opposed to what was supposed to be happening when you wrote it in stone a few months ago, is more transparent, and you know, people can make informed decisions from that. So whoever's receiving the report can say, okay, this is going to impact this, this, and this, and this is what I need to do as a result. I think there's, you know, a tendency for people to ignorance is bliss, right?
Absolutely.
Sometimes people find it more difficult to be confronted with what's happening regularly, but of course those of us who work in that way realise that actually the mitigation that you might need to perform is, by the same token, in smaller increments and therefore easier to handle.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because there's nothing worse than, if someone has been not telling you about something for a long period of time, and then you finally found out.
Getting a surprise.
And it's always more difficult to sort out the longer these things go on for. It just sort of snowballs into this massive thing to sort out.
Yeah, and also, hand in hand with that is a lot of people struggle with that concept of sort of, I suppose, short range planning because their releases are often so big. And they're planning to release their whole product in a big bang, or a whole new feature in a massive, again, big bang situation. Whereas if you're constantly releasing and making small incremental changes, that kind of thing makes it so much easier in terms of you haven't promised 7 different clients all these features in your next major release. You might have checked off a few throughout your delivery, and maybe there's 1 or 2 people that you disappoint rather than a whole group.
Yeah, and if something's wrong with the code, which hopefully there isn't, but things do go wrong, it's much easier to sort out problems on 2 or 3 features than it is on 100.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to tackle, and if you've worked as a more traditional project manager, you'll be familiar with that UAT period, which is the big bang we're just referring to, and certainly I've done it a number of times, where we deliver everything to the client, knowing quite well that some of it is not of great quality because we had to release it to meet the deadline. That wishful thinking. And then the client goes through and checks it feature by feature and comes back with a massive list of bugs, which seems to go on for months and months afterwards.
Absolutely.
And in some situations you find yourself negotiating it out. We've been working on these bugs for 6 months, we're actually going to stop here and agree that you're not going to pass a certain amount or whatever. It's an unhappy situation all round, developers not happy, project
nobody's
not
happy,
clients not happy. And it's incredibly stressful. And it's we're not talking about Agile being the be all and end all and the cure for everything, because sometimes quality isn't great on software for various reasons, but as I say, to fix it in smaller increments is much more efficient and manageable. And it means that when we do reach the end of the project, they'll have working software that is of high quality because we've been able to fix it as we released it.
Yeah, definitely.
Rather than sort of reaching their deadline and having a product that doesn't work.
Cool. So to bring it back to estimation, we've got a little bit sidetracked. I had another conversation with another Scrum Master, and he was saying that his product owner was having a real issue with getting relative sizing, getting his head around it.
Right.
And he was very much equating 1 point to 1 day, and points to sort of, I suppose, developer days.
Is that from what he'd seen in previous sprints? He was starting to do that?
No, he was very new to Scrum, and I didn't understand the relative sizing. So he sort of, and I think a lot of people do that when they're used to getting estimates in a time duration. They try and apply that to points and sort of go, all right, well, 1 point is 1 day, 2 points is 2 days.
I think, if you're looking, obviously it takes a few sprints to build it up, but more useful is looking at velocity. So if the velocity is 12 points, it's more useful to say, okay, so that's what we can achieve in a sprint, than to equate it with days. That doesn't make that much sense to me, but maybe you've been working with Agile for a while.
Yeah, and it was really interesting talking to the developers in that team, because they said subconsciously they'd done that when they started. So it was a new product owner coming into an existing team. Right. And they were having trouble explaining sort of what points meant to the product owner. But they had started with that sort of idea when they were new to it. but it had become sort of less of a, it had become, well, this is quite a complex story, this is not so complex, and as it should be. So the one analogy that I really like, that Mike Cohen used in a blog post is running. So if two people are standing at the end of a trail, and one person says that it's going to take them an hour to run the trail, another person says it's going to take them half an hour, they can argue and never reach consensus over how difficult,
it's gonna take them.
yeah, or how long it is, or anything like that. But if they then change the conversation and say, all right, well, the trail's a kilometre long, then they can both agree on that.
So it's talking about the size, not the time.
Yeah, and sort of the effort. So the product owner may not, if we bring that back to this, a Scrum situation, the product owner won't know, how long it's going to take a developer to complete a 2.
Yeah.
One developer it might take a day because they're really awesome. Another developer it might take 3 days. But he understands, they can all have a conversation together about the fact that a 2 is sort of, I don't know, for us it would be an average size story, and sort of a little bit of complexity, but not too bad.
To be said for splitting stories right down and making everything 1 or 2. That actually just makes it a lot simpler, and it's what we should be doing anyway, because smaller batch size increases productivity and decreases variability. So it's a good sort of rule to stick to. Well, not a rule, but I think it's a great pattern to start evolving in your teams. And that way, the product owner knows the size of all stories is going to be 1 or 2, and they'll get a sense for themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Of how many of those will achieve in a sprint. I think another point is that it's tricky if you're working with a company that's developed a product and your product owner is someone that also works with the company, because they are going to think about time. Whereas when you work as a service industry like us, and we have clients from outside, I can personally, as general manager as well as a scrum master, talk about it dollar terms. So for 2 weeks it's going to cost this, and then we can start to talk about what we think we can achieve in that 2 weeks. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, they can look at what's been achieved and think, do I feel this is giving me value?
Absolutely.
So that internal situation, a lot tougher though. I mean, they can look at how much it's costing, but a lot of people wouldn't think of it that way if they were working internally. They're much more likely to think about it in terms of amount of resource and time taken, as opposed to how much that resource cost. So it's sort of different depending on what sort of company you are and what you're doing, really.
Yeah, I mean the other thing, just briefly as well, is when you are in that situation where you've got multiple teams, either across your organisation or developing a single product, is points shouldn't mean anything across teams.
That's
so
right,
if
exclusive to the team.
Which is a really important thing. So one team in an organisation we've been working with, their velocity is about 40 points, but their average story size is 8 or something.
Yeah, so it's not like they're working longer hours.
Or
they're not developers. They just have a different scale.
They just have a different scale. So compared to another team which is actually bigger, and so more developers, probably get through more work relatively, but their velocity is a lot less because
say 15 or something. Yeah, like that.
Because their stories that come into the sprint are 2s and 1s. As a general rule, but they're probably the same amount of work. And that's why there's no point comparing teams' velocities. That velocity is really something to help us plan and to help us explain to the product owner approximately how much work we're going to get done during the sprint. As a relative to previous sprints though, so we might say, actually not just velocity but the total points per sprint. So we might say, last time we did 10, this time we've got an extra person, we're going to do 15. So relatively, we're going to get through X amount more work. So the sprint's really sized in a similar way to the way that stories are sized against each other. Maybe it's getting a bit complex now. Maybe I'll tell myself enough. Probably a good place to finish unless you've got any additional comments. No, I think we've covered it.
Done it to death. Okay.
Yeah.
So hopefully that was useful, and if anyone has any questions, just drop us a line at info@boost.co.nz. Thanks for joining us.
Cool. See ya.